Stanford University.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Pam. Pam got a lot of the major topics that I'm going to be talking about, and a number of the slides are going to look somewhat familiar, so I'm not going to take time re-explaining things that Pam already explained, but hopefully we'll have a chance to dive a little bit deeper and really want to keep this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions at any point, please do shoot up your hand, and I'm happy to try to address them as they pop up. I'm going to be showing you a lot of numbers, a lot of graphs. Definitely don't feel like you need to digest them all at once. You have them on your handouts and the references they came from if you want to dive more into detail. So really just, I'm trying to get out the broad themes that make life cycle assessment in particular both a useful tool and a complicated tool to apply, and then try to get into some of this vision for the future. Where are we moving forward with it? What's the context beyond biofuels, which I'll be focusing on for our case study? And particularly, how should we be using it as a tool, not just for policymaking decisions, but also engaging with the public and really getting to your public outreach question. How do we just inform people overall and empower them with information to make better decisions? So biofuels really is how I got into the life cycle assessment world, working with Pam and Luisa Fresco, who is a visiting professor from University of Amsterdam. And the fundamental question was basically, are biofuels better than alternatives? And we've already dived into a lot of the reasons that they may or may not be. The basic answer is it depends. It depends on what biofuels you're talking about, how these biofuels are produced. There's a serious spatial component. Where they're produced has a major impact as well in terms of the land use change, et cetera. And what are the alternatives that we're talking about? What are the bases for comparison that we're also interested in? Are we just interested in greenhouse gas emissions, or are we interested in other things? And life cycle assessment is essentially the tool that we've been using to look at this, dive in much more detail. And previously, it was something that was really an academic exercise. But what's been particularly interesting with biofuels, and why we're using it as our case study, is that biofuels all of a sudden have pushed this question of how should we do life cycle assessment into the policy arena. Because here in the US, we have the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS I have up there. And then in California, we have the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is basically mandating that we need to do life cycle assessment to figure out if biofuels are better than gasoline and by how much. And for the Renewable Fuel Standard in the US, we don't need to have a specific target for each biofuel, but we do need to actually do the quantification for each biofuel to figure out if a biofuel is classified as an advanced biofuel or a cellulosic biofuel, which then makes it eligible for additional tax credits. So essentially, what was an academic exercise with life cycle assessment is becoming a policy mandate that can translate to a lot of money flowing one direction or another. So it's been really interesting to see what's happened with LCA and biofuels, and it'll be interesting to see if it transfers to other technologies. So the biofuel life cycle, I'm not going to focus on it too much. I think for most of you, it's pretty old hat. So for us here in the US, it's basically corn ethanol that we're talking about. And so we're starting with the feedstock production, the corn growing, all the nitrogen fertilizer required there, the farm machinery. You have transportation throughout the process. You have all the energy used in the biorefinery, and for corn ethanol, this is basically the fermentation and distillation process, and water used to get, energy used rather to get the water there as well. And then you have the final greenhouse gas emissions coming out the car tailpipe. So this is just the full life cycle for biofuels, typically that's talked about. And when we're talking about this type of life cycle assessment, we term it attributional life cycle assessment, which is looking at the just inputs and outputs that are related to any given process, good, service, et cetera. And so for corn ethanol, again, the answer to is corn ethanol better than gasoline really depends on how that corn ethanol was produced, where that corn ethanol was produced. And so what you're looking at is a spider diagram, so it's a sensitivity analysis to a number of factors that can really change your results from doing one of these biofuel life cycle assessments. So for example, yield is a huge thing. if your yield, so this is your 0% deviation baseline you're starting with, if your yield goes down 25% or 15%, your embodied greenhouse gas emissions go up substantially, as you'd expect, because you have the same amount of inputs otherwise, lower yield off that land, and therefore the embodied greenhouse gas emissions that come from all those inputs are going to increase. Nitrogen fertilizers you expect, this green line here, basically the more fertilizer you have applied, or actually, sorry, nitrogen's this one, you have other fertilizers here, the more fertilizer that's applied per given unit of biofuel, the more embodied greenhouse gas emissions you're going to have. And then land use, land cover change is another big issue, and co-product credit is another interesting thing. Co-products are products that are produced with biofuel production. So with corn, when we're producing corn ethanol, we're not just making ethanol. We're generally making what are termed distillers' dried grains or distillers' wet grains, which are used for livestock feed. So it's an open question, how do you divvy up the overall greenhouse gas emissions that comes from that corn cultivation between the co-products, these grains that are going to animal feed, versus the biofuel production? Do you do it just based on mass? Do you do it based on economic value? Economic value has been the most common way to do it, but then of course if the relative prices of animal feed and ethanol change, then you have to readjust your numbers. So you can see sensitivity to co-product credit going down the other direction based on this analysis here. This is work from Winrock International out in DC, who I actually used to work with, that then used this analysis for the US EPA's calculations of biofuel life cycle assessment greenhouse gas emissions that actually went into the renewable fuel standard calculations. So the most common model that's been used for biofuel life cycle assessment in this attributional fashion is coming out of the Department of Energy. It's called the GREET model. It's basically just a giant spreadsheet that has all these input and output assumptions, thousands and thousands of cells, not particularly complicated to use other than the time that it takes to figure out how all those cells link together. And you can just see some output results here that show the differences, again, between different types of, in this case, fuel processing for the biofuel refinery. So where is your energy coming from when you're making that ethanol? Is it coming from coal? Here's new ethanol with coal. Is it coming from natural gas? New ethanol with NG, natural gas. And then what are you doing about those co-products? If you're producing wet distillers grains, you're going to have a lower greenhouse gas emissions than if you're just producing ethanol with natural gas. So basically illustrating some of the same points from the sensitivity diagram in the last graph, that it matters how you allocate co-products. It matters what sort of fuel that you're using at the production, the biorefinery plant level. Claire, did you have a question?
Yeah, just wondering, what's on the furthest right column?
The furthest, this one over here. Yeah, it's really small. You can hopefully see it in your notes. So that's new ethanol with biomass. And that would essentially be harvesting biomass and doing cellulosic ethanol with it, or you can also potentially collect the additional biomass residue from corn and use that, basically this corn husks and the stalks, to fire the facility. With sugarcane ethanol, this is one of the reasons that sugarcane ethanol ends up looking a lot better than corn ethanol with a life cycle assessment model, is that sugarcane ethanol, you take the leftover sugarcane residue, which is termed bagasse, crush that stuff, and then actually use that to fire your boiler. So ideally, you're not putting in any additional natural gas or coal to fire your facility. So you even have a surplus amount of bioenergy you can produce and use to produce electricity, which then you sell back into the grid. So that's one of the reasons that Brazilian sugarcane ethanol looks a lot better from a life cycle assessment perspective than corn ethanol in the US typically. Another element, this is again looking at sugarcane, so nice segue with a question, is what's going on not just with inputs at the cultivation level, but also some of the harvesting techniques can actually make a substantial difference. Specifically with sugarcane, it's really common, at least historically, even in the US, you can see a picture from Florida there, and still in Brazil to burn the sugarcane fields before they're harvested. It makes it easier to go in and chop the stalks, and in some places they do it to basically kill off snakes and other things that the harvesters are worried about when they go into harvest. In the Philippines, where I worked on a case study on the island of Negros, it's much less common to do this burning. Typically what they do is what you see right there. They just go straight in with by hand harvest stalks, and then they'll take the extra tops and leaves, and sometimes they'll stack them and burn them. In some cases, they're then taking those and burning those to produce additional biopower at the biorefinery that's also producing ethanol. And then in Brazil, there's also been a shift towards mechanized harvesting, which means that fields are not getting burned. So this is something that matters in terms of embodied greenhouse gas emissions, because when fields are getting burned, you're having incomplete combustion, N2O, and methane emissions, which then translates to a couple gases that have much higher global warming potential than you have just if it was CO2 with these naturally degrading. And something Pam already mentioned, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but what the land use was where you're growing the biofuel makes a huge difference. This is some work by Holly Gibbs, who was here at Stanford and has now moved on to, I think, University of Wisconsin. And one biofuel crop in particular that was getting a lot of buzz was oil palm, which when you look at most elements of an attributional life cycle assessment, looks like a really great crop. It's a tropical crop that produces a lot of oil for relatively low inputs. But the kicker with it is most of it is grown, it has very limited range where you can grow it with high productivity. And that area tends to be in tropical forests with high carbon stocks, and particularly in tropical peatland. So if you look at forest, if forest is cleared to grow oil palm, that's this bar down here, this is the carbon payback time. So the amount of time that the carbon savings that you get from having oil palm biodiesel versus regular diesel, the amount of time it takes for that carbon debt that you initially got from the land clearing to be paid back with that carbon savings on an annual basis. So if you're clearing forest in Indonesia, say, for oil palm and biodiesel production, you're going to end up taking at least 100 years to pay that back. This little asterisk over here is if you're clearing peatland in Indonesia specifically, where you have these peat swamps that have huge amounts of soil carbon stored up in this anaerobic environment where they're saturated with water. And in that case, if that peatland is cleared and that carbon pretty quickly degrades after it's drained, it could take almost 1,000 years to pay back. So really doesn't make sense if you look at the land use change side. If you forget to look at the land use change side in the LCA, then it looks great. So really important to incorporate land use into any sort of LCA. And on the plus side, this is another slide from the Philippines where I was working a couple of years ago. There are potentials to have positive land use change effects with biofuels. In this case, they have a sugarcane ethanol refinery that's surrounded by a lot of land that looks like this. It's really degraded. It was deforested about 100 years ago. And what they're now doing is working with a number of small farmer collectives, growing short harvest woody biomass crops. They get cut about every 4 to 5 years, and actually increasing the soil carbon and the above ground carbon in the process. So it is possible that biofuels in some cases could actually have net land use change benefits, but it's highly dependent on basically what your business as usual scenario is too when you're doing these calculations. And then the complication that Pam got into a little bit, that I'll dive into a little bit more with biofuels, is not just looking at what we term an attributional life cycle assessment, these inputs and outputs from the raw materials production, the crops, to the processing, post-processing, and then combustion in the tailpipe, but looking beyond that to what's termed a consequential life cycle assessment. So that's trying to address this question of what happens when we have corn that we were previously using for food, and all of a sudden we start using it for biofuel. So just based on basic laws of supply and demand, we assume that that's going to be increasing the price of corn, which is probably going to be then increasing the likelihood that farmers will rotate more crops of corn versus crops of soy that they were previously rotating more evenly. So then soy is going to be growing less, and soy prices should then go up as well. And that, in turn, should, as you have corn and soy prices rising, then impact the price of livestock and the price of meat. And ultimately, with higher soy prices and higher meat prices, then, for example, farmers in the Amazon, at least just based on economic models, should have more incentive to go further into the Amazon and deforest to range cattle and grow soy. So there's been this, what's termed indirect land use change impact that's been attributed to biofuels now. There was a paper a couple of years ago that really brought this to the fore, and it's been something that's been very controversial ever since, just how should we calculate this indirect land use change number. And so basically the way we calculate this at the moment is we do this macroeconomic equilibrium modeling that tries to look at those price modulated effects throughout the whole global economy. But they require us to model the whole global economy, which we're probably not that good at based on our current economic situation. So it's something where these impacts, these consequential impacts, are real, and we maybe have an idea what the magnitude of them are, but it's to the point where even if we can get the models perfect, we can never really tell if they're perfect or not, because we can't trace fully from a cornfield in Iowa to deforestation going on in a part of the Amazon. It's just never going to happen. So what should we actually do with this analysis, and how should we adjust those numbers? That's something that it has actually been incorporated into the low carbon fuel standard here in California, as well as a renewable fuel standard, but it's still hotly debated, and I think it will continue to be. Yeah.
So on that point, it would probably be further in this direction. If you could calculate, for instance, a bushel of corn diverted to fuel versus a bushel of corn for food, and how many gallons of gasoline that translates to for a 1% increase in corn, you might be able to look at what is a tank of gas in terms of how many people might go hungry over the course of the year. So 16 million people, 1% rise in food, there are about 16 million tanks of gasoline, and one out of every 10. It might be something when people are pumping gasoline that they could be more conscious of.
Yeah.
It's not abstract. It's one person in 100 is probably bigger.
It probably is. Just the question is how much, and it's really hard to verify that at this point with the models that we have. We're constantly trying to improve them, but yeah, I think that's a good point. This is just illustrated not to have you absorb it all, but just to bring up the point that it is really complicated. This is the modeling that the US EPA used for the renewable fuel standard greenhouse gas emissions calculations for various biofuels. A combination of attributional life cycle assessment and a number of different general equilibrium economic models for figuring out indirect land use change impacts. They also looked at indirect impacts on livestock production, both in the US and outside. And it's really complicated, is the main take-home message I want you to get from this. And after doing all that, this is what they came up with. So here's your gasoline baseline. Vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the tailpipe, and then this is the greenhouse gas emissions attributed to the fuel production side. And then for biofuels, I won't go into all these different little pieces, but mainly look at this green chunk, which is what EPA calculated for international land use change, and that number is still hotly debated. And with that added in, average dry mill natural gas ethanol came out slightly better than gasoline, and it needed to get 20% better to meet the biofuel 20% reduction threshold for getting tax subsidies. And it barely made that. In the first analysis, it didn't actually make that, and then there was a lot of political hemming and hawing, and how scientific it is that it dropped below that, I'm not entirely sure, honestly. But the main take home here is that land use chunk, indirect land use change chunk, is really substantial, and it could be a lot bigger than that. Some analyses have had it a lot bigger than that. And even the EPA's own analysis had it a lot bigger than that. So this is looking at either positive land use change or negative land use change conversion for pasture, crop, and forest in the blue, different sections of the world. And GTAP is the probably most commonly used model for this. FAPRI is another model used for that. And you can see those models have some agreement, but there are some pretty big discrepancies too in terms of where land use will change around the world based on the renewable fuel standard biofuel targets. And another thing that hasn't been incorporated into any sort of life cycle assessment at this point are changes in albedo. It's just starting to be looked at. So albedo is basically a fancy way for saying reflectivity of the Earth's surface. So as you guys all know, lighter surfaces are cooler. They reflect more light and energy. Darker surfaces are warmer. They absorb more light and energy. And so if you're changing the reflectiveness of the Earth's surface, you're going to change how the Earth is absorbing or reflecting energy. So this is looking at jatropha, which is an oilseed crop that's widely talked about as a good thing to use on degraded lands potentially. And if you just look at the carbon stocks with jatropha, this is taking out the life cycle assessment inputs and outputs, just looking at how specifically a grassland in South Africa responds to being planted with jatropha. You have additional carbon in the ground based on the baseline grassland scenario they're looking at, but you end up having more, basically it's less reflective with all that green jatropha growing there. And that additional absorption of energy means that your total global warming forcing from that land use change actually ends up being higher. And this is just something that's starting to be looked at. Actually, Chris Field's group over at Carnegie Department of Global Ecology is doing a lot of work with this. But at this point, these numbers aren't included in any of those biofuel numbers that you'll see elsewhere. And then we have life cycle assessment. What about beyond greenhouse gas emissions? Pam talked about a lot of this already, so I'll breeze through quickly. Obviously, habitat and biodiversity impacts. Biofuels are moving from having kind of this magical energy source under the ground with petroleum that we've been using for transportation for such a long time to all of a sudden being much more land use intensive. And this is the case with solar and wind power as well. So more land use means more potential impacts on species and biodiversity. Fresh water use, all crops that you're growing are using water. Some of them use a lot of water. And particularly new biofuel crops like jatropha that I just mentioned, those water use numbers could be extremely high. Some studies have them much, much lower than that. And then water quality. We've got fertilizer that we're adding to all these crops, which not only has embodied energy and greenhouse gas emissions, but it also leads to nitrogen runoff into ecosystems, impacts like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And then the food versus fuel issues that Pam already brought up that I won't get into, they really link up with that question of indirect impacts. What are the price impacts, and how do those ultimately impact people on the social side as well? And there have been a number of studies that have looked at this with widely varying conclusions. I think the take-home message I'd like to toss out there, because often you'll hear people say that, say, jatropha, for example, is a great biofuel crop because it's not a food crop. It's something that is actually toxic if you eat it in its standard form. It really doesn't matter, though. If you're using land that would be used to grow food otherwise, you should, just based on basic supply and demand, be impacting food prices. And whether that impact is really substantial or not so substantial, we still don't really know for a number of reasons. One of them is there's also been a tremendous spike in the last decade in commodities investment. And so with all this investment portfolio money going into commodities futures, it's still a very hotly debated topic in the finance world if that's impacting commodity prices, which translate to impacting food prices. And without being able to sort that out, we have a really hard time doing this indirect impact modeling and sort out impacts that biofuels directly have on food prices as well. And another point that Pam brought up is already we know that there are a lot of things beyond greenhouse gas emissions that we want to look at. And there are some neat systems that are being developed called life cycle impact analyses that allow us to look at multiple criteria at once. But it's still a debated topic. How much should we say care about water use versus greenhouse gas emissions versus biodiversity impacts versus human health impacts? Because ultimately, when we're creating these unified life cycle impact indicator systems, we are making pretty qualitative judgments about the relative importance of these different metrics. And so again, you should take these numbers a bit with a grain of salt, but I think it's important to do these types of analyses to at least get us started. So take home again that I think you already got from Pam, biofuel greenhouse gas emissions reductions don't necessarily translate to overall environmental benefits or overall social benefits when we look at these kind of aggregate metrics. Water use is something that is also particularly spatially variable. And so even if a biofuel looks great in one context, it's really important to look at the specific spatial context. Greenhouse gas emissions doesn't really matter if they're emitted here in China and Brazil, et cetera. Water use, it really matters if you're using the water in a water-stressed environment or an environment that's water abundant. And so, for example, if you look at the Eco Indicator 99 here, which is another one of those unified life cycle impact assessment metrics that looks at human health and other ecosystem impacts beyond greenhouse gas emissions, using water to grow, in this case we're looking at cotton, not biofuels, but you can extrapolate for anything you're using water for. Egypt, for example, uses a little bit less water per unit of cotton than Uzbekistan does, but a much higher percentage of the overall impact of that water use is happening in Egypt versus Uzbekistan, primarily because Egypt has less developed sanitation infrastructure, more water scarcity. This is just looking at a national level, so obviously you'd want to go even deeper if you're really trying to dive into, is this biofuel right for this specific spatial context, this specific location? And abandoned, degraded agricultural lands, often talked about as places we should start for biofuel production because we have at least supposedly available land to grow biofuels on. But I think something that's important to remember about these lands, first of all, is whether or not these lands are actually abandoned, degraded, and available, which can be a political issue. But assuming that they are, you may end up having albedo impacts in these lands different from what you expected. Land use change, you probably have some carbon stocks that have built up if those lands have actually been degraded. Water use impacts in those abandoned, degraded lands probably are going to end up actually being higher because they're probably abandoned, degraded agricultural lands because they're not particularly water abundant, which tends to be the case. And if you're growing in those marginal soils, marginal lands, you're probably going to have pretty marginal yields, which, as you saw with the spider diagram a while back, have a huge impact on your embodied greenhouse gas emissions. So marginal yields means that you have potentially higher greenhouse gas emissions with the same amount of inputs. And of course, now we've kind of moved beyond biofuels as being the sexy topic for transportation sustainability to electric vehicles. And when you look at how biofuels, here's different models with soy biodiesel and corn ethanol, how they compare to electric vehicles. In California, at least, here are EVs over here, the biofuels look substantially worse. So the quick assumption is, yeah, we should just shift towards electric vehicles, which in California maybe actually is the case. But again, it's really spatially dependent on what the situation is, particularly with the utilities grid, which makes it so much more important for us to continue linking in with all the other renewable energy technologies. So in China, for example, where coal is the major driver of energy production, if you look at greenhouse gas emissions for electric vehicles versus gasoline, so that's the red line up there, and then hybrid electric vehicles, so you're kind of Prius equivalent, in many parts of China, electric vehicles actually look worse on the greenhouse gas side than just standard gasoline cars, and they certainly look worse than hybrids. And that's just on the greenhouse gas emission side. If you care more about sulfur dioxide emissions, which are not very well controlled at Chinese coal-fired power plants, it's substantially, it can be 3, 4, 5 times more sulfur dioxide emissions associated with driving a mile in an electric vehicle versus driving a mile with a gasoline vehicle. So again, a lot of spatial dependency in how we should be comparing to different alternatives. And the last point I want to hit is stakeholder engagement, which has come up. Because again, this spatial aspect of whether something is a net environmental and social good versus a net environmental and social negative really is very spatially dependent, and it really depends how we want to weigh our different impacts that we're looking at. And the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels has been a group that's we've worked with a little bit here at Stanford. It's a multi-stakeholder process that's brought together folks in industry, big oil companies, academia, biofuel producers, and they really have tried to get distribution between the global north and the global south. So there are a lot of different voices and a lot of different geographies and perspective represented in creating what has become a sustainability certification system. And to get certified as an RSB certified biofuel, a sustainable biofuel, you have to be able to check off essentially all these boxes. Are you legal? What are your greenhouse gas emissions like? They have a reduction threshold they require. What are you doing in terms of human and labor rights, rural and social development, conservation, soil, water, air, etc. And it's been a very long process. At times it's been a painful process. There's definitely been disagreements. But if you really want to get at long-term sustainability for these technologies, this kind of process, I think, is really essential. There's been a similar process that's gone on with the Renewable Energy Transmission Initiative here in California that's been great. And here's just a smattering of all the different groups. This isn't even at all the different groups, but to just give you an idea of the different types of groups that have been involved in the renewable fuel certificate, or sorry, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels. It's everybody from WWF and Shell to small farmer cooperatives in Latin America and Africa.
And the goal being?
What's that?
And the goal being?
The goal for the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels? So the goal is to create a certification system for sustainable biofuels by all these different groups.
I'm sorry, eventually who will be the authority?
That will monitor that? So they'll certify third-party verifiers similar to organic certification or the forestry stewardship certification.
Is it private sector?
It's a private, public, and academia collaborative. So the European Union's been particularly active in helping develop it. And EPFL in Switzerland is where it's officially housed, but there are people and institutions all over the place that have contributed to it.
Thank you.
No problem. So we're almost out of time, and I'll try to breeze through just a few thoughts on where we're going with this. What is the road ahead, not just for biofuels and life cycle assessment, but more broadly for looking at sustainability in this life cycle context. It's really important to be accounting for improving technologies. Obviously, biofuels are going to be advancing, electric vehicles are going to be advancing, different things that are feeding into the grid, those technologies are going to be advancing as well, as at least we hope. There's a cool company in Alameda called Bacani Power that's doing tethered wind that may make wind power much more affordable offshore, for example. Another company over there, Natel Energy, that's doing low-head hydro systems that also may dramatically reduce the environmental impacts associated with hydropower build-out. And I think the last piece that we need to work on, and this is something that all of us in the room collaboratively hopefully can help push forward, is just better life cycle assessment information transfer, not just to policymakers, investors, governments, and industry, but all the way down to ultimately all of us, consumers that are buying products. So the more that we're able to take life cycle assessment information that not only applies to biofuels, but all products, so you can take these same life cycle accounting methodologies and apply them to a cotton t-shirt or to a can of Coke, et cetera. Get to the point where we can have these environmental and societal impact indicators actually tagged on to each product and service beyond what we see just with organic labels or FSC certified labels. I think we really can start empowering a lot more bottom-up change. And maybe I'm drinking the Kool-Aid because we're here in Silicon Valley, but I really do think that the fact that we're all essentially walking around with what used to be supercomputers in our pockets that are networked to everything, everywhere, all over the world, means we have this really powerful tool for essentially leveraging what we've done with information technology, combining it with this quantitative trade-off assessment that we're doing with sustainability and clean technology, and creating this really powerful tool for informing, empowering, and incentivizing people to think more about their own personal sustainability, which hopefully in turn will translate to a lot more transparency of supply chains and supply chain sustainability in the life cycle assessment context. So there are a number of cool companies that are out there doing that sort of stuff. O-Power is doing this with your utility bill versus your neighbor's utility bill. Good Guide allows you to look at a bunch of different products that are in the market and life cycle assessment based metrics on environmental indicators and human health indicators that allow you to see how this pair of jeans compares to another pair of jeans. Recycle Bank is rewarding people for recycling and now for doing other sustainability activities. And my own little plug is I'm working on a startup called OroEco that's trying to basically take life cycle assessment information, link it up with spending and investment data through mint.com, and then create a platform that's fun and engaging for people to have not just numbers, but see relative metrics versus how they're doing versus their neighbors and what's normal, basically, and then actually get rewarded for reducing indifferent impacts. So with that, I do want to say that it does seem like we have lots and lots of options out there. We often look at just how these options compare in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and price. I'm hoping that we're going to start looking more in a broad sustainability context with life cycle assessment numbers. It's really important that we use what we have, at least, to quantify trade-offs, try to share data, make it as open as possible, and make sure that we're accounting for spatial variation along the way, and really engage stakeholders, which not only means governments, institutions, companies, but really all of us, because we're all decision makers, whether we know it or not, anytime that we're going into the store and we're buying a product. Basically, it's kind of cliche to say, but nonetheless true, we're voting with our wallets every day. And the more that we empower people with information that's based in science and hopefully constantly improving and incentivize people for making better choices, hopefully we can be driving change from the bottom up as well as the top-down approach that's been a little more traditional. And all this stuff is complicated, but I think we just need to get going now. We don't have enough time to wait for perfect information unless we do happen to build a time machine sometime in the future. So I don't want to bank on that. And thanks a lot for sticking around. I'm happy to stick around and take questions. I think we're hitting our time right now, right? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you both.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.